Right, this is going to be another episode of Thorinquiry, my interview series here on my side channel. And my guest for this one is going to be Auron MacIntyre, who is a political thinker and writer. You actually just got a new job, right? Who is it you're writing for now?
Yeah, I actually just got hired over at the Blaze, so I'm doing columns for them, and I'm also doing a show for them as well that's going to be rolled out here soon.
Right, and then the other question I have is, I've actually watched a lot of your videos and followed you on Twitter and stuff, but like, I don't actually know your career story or your background. So if you can just give me some overview. Is it the case, this is the gist I got, aren't you someone who was essentially like a mainstream journalistic figure, and you've sort of gone, look, again, if I put out any names, you're already being grouped in this. But I almost saw it as more of like, you've gone down the vein of like Matt Taibbi and people like Glenn Greenwald, where they've moved away from like mainstream outlets to sort of like smaller ones, or making an independent brand. Am I on point there? Am I off?
Well, kind of. I was never really. I did local journalism, so I started. I studied politics in college and worked in kind of small scale, like American Republican politics with the GOP. Again, nothing big. And then I moved on to be a kind of a political reporter and crime reporter for kind of a local paper. So I was never, working for CNN or any of these guys like people like Glenn Greenwald were. But it did put me on a path of saying, hey, yeah, things don't work the way I'm supposed to. News media is broken, politics is broken, need to look more into this. And that's how I started kind of researching and writing and recording stuff about it.
Right. Because another thing I actually found very interesting about your work in particular is, I've noticed if people go and they watch on YouTube any videos that are like debates about politics, discussions about politics, actually most of them, I would say, sort of veer into the territory of that dreaded term people came up with a few decades ago, infotainment. Like they are like let's put out, without naming names, if people know the big famous people who debate on Twitch, for example. That's just like a moron's political version of like a Jake Paul boxing match, in contrasted to what real boxing would be. It's the spectacle. And if you listen to the people talking, I even get the vibe, mate, as someone in the content space, I can tell when people like have a really like deep knowledge base and they're like hinting at it or they're making pulls from it. And I have to say, mate, most of the people I see online, the joke is the hobby seems to actually be doing the videos and the content about politics, not ever reading any deeper or reading any theory. And so the joke is the Twitch debates in 2022 really are still sort of like capitalism versus socialism. It's like, what? Like this isn't even like a 101 class. Like the joke is the two people debating don't seem to have any sort of depth. Do you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, actually, we used to call these political blood sport. Like right. We used to call these streams, because they just, you're right. There's not a lot of content there. It's a lot of guys lining up to kind of run through their talking points and then kind of just throw studies at each other or that kind of thing. Like there's never any actual exploration of the kind of the stuff behind the topic, which is why I don't think political debates in general are very useful. I'm always interested to talk to people who want to kind of gain a better understanding and kind of want to grasp each other's worldview better. I've talked to lots of people who are like Marxists and stuff. They entirely disagree with me, but I'm happy to have those conversations. But I don't understand people who just walk in and like want to have an arena fight over politics. That's just so it's useless. Like you said, it's entirely entertainment. It's just to see someone get their nose bloodied, nothing else.
One thing to get into this discussion, and by the way, for anyone listening, I do not claim to be anything close to a political expert. I'm just someone who's read things and had thoughts of my own. Some of them align with the great thinkers. Some of them, I'm sure, are very naive. And much as I would hope everyone finds in their life, every few years you have ideas you think are sort of risible now. They seem silly, in fact, but you might have held them as important foundational thoughts years earlier. So what I'll say is this. One area I am interested in when I look at anything to do with ideologies, so politics obviously plays right into this, is I try to do this thing that it seems like a lot of people don't in the modern day, which is I don't try and sit as someone in 2022 and go, right, we've figured it all out now. Now let me just take my brain and all this cultural programming and look at this thing from 100, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, and judge it through this lens. I always try to actually think, What was the guy who wrote this? What was his worldview before he came to these ideas? Like, what background did he grow up in? What pressures, what incentives were there? So one thing I would ask is this. I feel like a reason why a lot of the theory and the great theory on politics isn't read that much, or it's only read by weirdos on the internet or professors, etc., is because if you look at the background, for most of human history, I'd even say now, but obviously in theory, people have access to the internet. For most of human history, even the concept of politics, economics, political theory, these were very much like upper class topics. These were things for the aristocracy. These are people who were considered and bred to be elites. They're not really the sort of thing that the guy who's in a fish market or in a mine, he's never even approaching these topics. He's never thinking about it. So I always feel like that almost gives them a mystique. What do you think on that?
Well, yeah, I think that the idea of mass participation in politics, the idea that the average person would kind of be thoroughly soaked in the consumption of political content is really new, right? It's a very recent thing. Throughout most of human history, like you said, ruling and discussions on like how you would rule and how power should be used and politics and all that stuff, that was really a discussion for a very small percentage of people who were either educated or came up in a class that would have, kind of passed on that knowledge through tradition and duty, those kind of things. It was not something that your average person was interested in, nor was it something that they would have really thought was like their duty to be involved in, right? And so this feeling that like everyone needs to have a political ideology and be thoroughly versed on political theory or what's going on in the world, and then have an opinion that they need to be able to support and debate and argue and vote on and force other people to. Again, these are all relatively very new ideas. And so I do think, for the most part, a lot of this stuff doesn't get circulated because it wasn't meant for popular consumption in the first place.
Yes. One thing I would ask is this. Do you actually think, as a selling point, does political theory have like a basis upon which it can rest and essentially have some kind of efficacy in the world? Like, to give a quick explanation of what I mean by that. If someone was to say back in the day, especially classically with religion, obviously, the easiest get out on religion is you just say, it's from God, therefore what more authority does it need? It's from God. Like, if you believe in the premise of God, that's your foundational piece of the building, we can build the rest of the building on that. Like, that's the piece you need. Hence, by the way, unsurprisingly, why when you take God out, that whole building falls down, right? In the modern day, someone might naively say, well, more like the scientific worldview, which I guess would be rephrased as it works, is what they would maybe say. But I'd even say in itself, I'm not even sure science holds up to that. If you look at a lot of the modern day science, they consider cutting edge. Like, I'll tell you just briefly, when I've looked into things like astrophysics, the joke is some of it doesn't work. They even explicitly know it doesn't work, and they add in things like constants to make it work, if you know what I mean, which is almost the logic of like, this doesn't actually work, but it should. And so I'm going to make it work. And then now that I've made it work, this proves that it's right, which is like, that doesn't really work. So what I want to ask as a roundabout way of saying it is, do you actually think there are political theories or ideologies that have some sort of basis in, and I know this is like this, if this was a John Peterson interview, this would be the worst question you could ever ask, that on some level something about it is true or resonates with something real? What do you think in that regard?
Yeah, we could debate truth for 3 hours.
Exactly.
Right? That'd be a good use of time. So the thing is, like, it depends on the schools of political theory, right? And larger political philosophy. Because there are, of course, more classical schools of political philosophy that come from people like Plato and Aristotle, that down through like people like Aquinas. And they are looking at kind of the world mostly in the way it should be, right? The orientation for that is like, this is how the world should be ordered.
Yes.
And then we have the branch of political theory that I tend to focus on, which is more Machiavellian political theory. And Machiavelli is, of course, famous for kind of a realist political theory, right? Looking, the people who developed political theory based on Machiavellian practice, people like Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto, are people who were more interested in studying it more sociologically, like as a discipline and an explanation of the actual mechanical functions of politics, as opposed to the ideological ends of politics. So if you does political theory work, do you mean can models from political theory accurately describe the world around us and explain why mechanisms of politics work? Then yes, I think it does have that. It does have that quality. However, when you do Machiavellian political theory, you have to remember that you're separating it from ideology, and so often it cannot tell you the ends you actually want to achieve. Right. It might explain the mechanisms of politics, but it won't tell you what you want to achieve with those mechanisms, which is a really important part and something that people forget when they get too deep into Machiavellian political analysis. They'll figure out everything, but if you try to reduce it all down to just its bare parts, you forget that there's like actually people in a human society you're trying to better. And if you don't remember that, then your political analysis is just raw power and it's useless. It doesn't actually orient you towards anything worth understanding.
Yes. Like one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I notice you do dip between these worlds. Like sometimes on Twitter, you are just in the everyday back and forth of the current happening, what's going on, the correct thing, all those narratives, etc. But then you do these videos and these articles where you are diving into the bigger picture, the theory, the broader perspective on stuff. So what I would actually ask is this. One thing that I find weird in life is like a lot of when I was a young lad, I was very influenced by people like Robert Anton Wilson. And one of the things I took from his work, even though now I probably wouldn't align with a lot of it, was the perspective of seeing things. I mean, he had that term like reality tunnel. I would just take the term of like just taking different philosophies and ideologies as lenses. And I would consider like you use one lens for one thing, one lens for it. It depends what you want to look at and how you want to look at it would be the analogy to keep the lens analogy going. And what I would say is this. I've found even when I disagree with massive fundamental concepts that in theory should make it not possible to get into some of these things. Like, for example, maybe, I'll be very careful how I phrase this, maybe I don't think any elections run the way that it's presented as. Now, that's not as simple as I'm saying they're not legit. Basically, I think they're all cheating all the time and in every country, and there's always foreign interests taking part. Basically, I think essentially like what we're presented with is an artifice, and it's very surface level for people who aren't supposed to think more about it. And when I think about things like that, it can make it seem like, well, who cares about them? What, this flowery writing of this brilliant guy in the 17th or 18th century. But then there's another level where when I put on the lens, though, and I sort of accept their premises and I dive in, they are brilliant thinkers and brilliant writers. I mean, just put it this way, to give a modern day reference, if people don't know, I'll pick another influence of mine. Even though now I would disagree with almost everything. Obviously, everything's ridiculous. A lot of things fundamentally about like Christopher Hitchens' perspective, for example. But if I sort of accept the premises and I dive into his worldview, it's obviously a fantastic orator. He's a very interesting writer. His reference game is phenomenal. So essentially what I would ask you is how much are you yourself, in light of the fact you say you think political theories can actually like be representative of real things or things that work, etc. How much do you think, how much are you putting on a hat or using a lens to engage with some of this stuff, whether it's the everyday, whether it's the more abstract? And how much is there, like, do you have a belief in this stuff?
Well, I think the lens is a really good metaphor. Like, it's a really good word picture, right? Because the trick with you using a lens is you have to close one eye to look through the telescope or the microscope, right?
Yes.
And so what you're doing is you are artificially limiting your field of vision in order to gain additional ability to see something in a limited field, right? And that's a really good way to understand kind of what we're doing, because in our world, we are really obsessed with specialization, right? Our world is built on this idea. You become the best scientist, or you become the best political thinker, you become the best esports broadcaster, you become the best rock star. Like everything is under specialization. And so everyone spends like 20 or 30 or more years of their life trying to get really good at one field. And if you do that, then your field needs to be really important, right? Like every scientist thinks science is going to save the world, and every priest thinks that religion is going to save the world, and every politician thinks politics saves the world, and every teacher thinks education saves the world, because like that's how we're wired, right? If I spent 30 years of my life perfecting something, it's got to be the most important thing. And so I think the mistake that we make often is thinking that like we forget that like we had to close that one eye to focus, to, like, in order to use the lens, in order to like gain the expertise and drill down with that perspective, we had to close off a part of our understanding of the world. And the problem with that is when you do that, you forget that like there's a much wider thing than your area of expertise will allow you to understand, which is how like people made such big mistakes with stuff like the pandemic and stuff, right? It's like they're only focused on one thing, and that can be the only solution because that's what they're good at. And so when I look at these different types of political analysis, I try to keep that in mind, that, like I said, if you look at Machiavellian political analysis, it can tell you so much. It can be so valuable, but there's an obvious error, and one that many of the guys who wrote this stuff themselves made, where they said, well, none of this matters. It's all power all the way down. All ideology is simply justification, naked justifications for power, and none of it means anything. But that is a mistake in itself. That's a foolish thing, because you're closing your mind to the other things that influence the world. And nothing is one thing. There is no one grand unifying theory. The world is too complex. It resists those types of explanations. So they're very useful when you're analyzing things. There's nothing wrong with putting that lens on and understanding, but just don't forget you close that other eye, because if you open it back up, you might realize that you have completely ignored an essential part of the universe, the world, humanity, that will completely mess up your model and your understanding of what's going on.
Sure. I mean, along these lines, then, one thing I would ask is, because another thing I find so weird about people who they think they are in the political space, like I say, people on YouTube, people who are trying to make themselves almost niche figures, is they also seem to have this weird view. Like, look, some of this does veer into, let's say, modern progressive ideology, the notion that you can just throw away all of history and there is nothing to conserve and it was all a bunch of nonsense by idiots in the past and we've progressed. It's why I think the word progress has probably done more damage than anything else in the last 200 years, because you just slap that word on anything and suddenly it justifies everything you're doing, justifies everything that you don't want to do. It's ridiculous how they use that term just at a surface level as if it carried the deep meaning of what you think progress means. So what I would say is, it seems like a lot of those people, that's why I say they're just having 101 level discussions. They seem to think that their brain turning on to look at one topic, the first thoughts that come out are gold somehow. Meanwhile, they barely scratch the surface. So what I would ask is this: in life in general, even though I myself in my own field, for example, have been iconoclastic and I've tried to have my own unique ideas, I do actually respect the notion, and this sort of ties into the concept of conservatism, I guess, that you learn the rules before you break them, if you know what I mean. You sort of learn why that was a rule and why it was established and why it works to some degree. Then you try and say, I disagree, or I'm going to do it differently, or I'm going to invent something new. So what I would ask you is this, maybe it's a layup question, but I'll ask anyway. Do you think if people want to think deeply about these topics, or they want to have something beyond surface, do they need to go and study the classic names? If I was to reel off, John Stuart Mill, Marx, Kropotkin, Thomas Paine, David, the classics, should people go and ground themselves in this work, do you think? Will a modern day person get something out of it?
Yeah, I think you kind of have to, if you want to address certain things. Not every thinker is absolutely essential. Not everything is foundational. You can, you can think about these things deeply without necessarily having to go to every single person someone would hit in a philosophy course. But if you just have no foundation and no grounding for the traditions that have come before you, then you don't know oftentimes that you are kind of reassembling a tradition that's already failed without realizing it. Actually, yes. I see this a lot in our current day with people in kind of the sensible center, like the IDW, yes. the intellectual dark web guys. A lot of times these people are they came out of kind of moderate liberalism, whatever, and they're this isn't working anymore, we should try something different. And they don't know anything about the opposing side. They never looked into any of their thinkers. They never read deeply into it. And they just kind of start haphazardly reconstructing basically conservatism, but they haven't read anything about it. They don't know anything about it. They don't have any linkage to it. And so they just kind of make a lot of the mistakes that previous thinkers have made. They end up in pitfalls and traps that people have previously already overcome, but they don't know that because they're just not familiar at all. So you don't have to read everything. You don't have to be I don't think you need to have graduate level philosophical study on everything to kind of explore these issues. But I think at the very least, you should have a mind that is willing to explore these. I really suggest reading these works. Read the primary sources. Don't read.
Right. Don't have some other guy explain it to you.
Yeah, don't walk into like, some Barnes and Noble and get like, Batman philosophy or whatever,
right.
all this trash philosophy books that are sitting on their shelves. And do not read the introductions by modern people about older books. Read the books first. Do not let anyone mess with your perception of it. Read it. Do your best to understand it. If you don't understand it, that's okay. Read it again slowly. Take notes. Like, think about it. But don't let other people completely color your understanding of what you're about to experience before you do. And I think that will allow people, even if you don't have a completely like classical philosophical education, will allow you to explore things in a way inside traditions, inside, understandings, in a way that will kind of still allow you to think for yourself in some ways.
One thing I'm actually quite interested by that you just said there, I thought was a very good point, is a classic observation people make, which certainly has some grounding, is that if you look at the debates, let's just make it normal people instead of experts. If you look at the debates, we'll just use the rough term of between left and right. I would say among normal people, I agree. It actually typically does tend to be the case that the conservative / right-wing people have a sense of what the left-wing people think and believe. They just totally disagree, and in most cases, especially with the religious, think it's morally wrong. And then the left-wing people actually seem to, currently in the modern day particularly, just seem to be caught up in sort of the straw man version of what their opponent is. And because they actually think, funnily enough, on their own weird version of morals, just not based on religion, that they're wrong as well. They think that they almost don't even need to know about that. But I actually think a point you made there is actually quite telling, which is when you go up a level, though, and in theory now we're talking about people who are supposed to be more informed, I actually think that a lot of conservative / right-leaning people are very naive about left-wing / socialist ideas. Like, put it this way, Auron, even though typically people would assume I'd be in that crowd who would be like, well, communism is the worst thing ever, and socialism, oh my God, this is socialism, this is ruining America, and all that jazz, right? I never get into that because I have to say, to me, I think in every field and in every leaning, there is some genius guy, there is some brilliant writer, there's some great orator, there's some guy who has his own take on it. Like I say, maybe he's just accepted that lens, but within that lens, he's doing something interesting. Because I have to say, even though it might shock some people, I follow a couple of people on Twitter who would absolutely describe themselves as Marxist-Leninists. And even though I disagree with some of the philosophy, some of their angles are brilliant, mate. Like, it's not, I have to even believe in it. They're just intellectually, it's very stimulating. They're clearly doing something different I haven't thought of on certain aspects. What do you think of to this? Because you've sort of alluded to the idea that you're a little bit more open in that regard too, right? You're not as much tribal, right?
Well, I would say I am on a team, but I would say that it's certainly, I think the definition of at least the American version of conservatism is pretty broken. And so I'm much more willing to incorporate things that sometimes get me called things like a socialist, because I don't necessarily believe that the government doesn't have a role in certain things, or I don't believe, I'm not a libertarian. I'm not under this impression that like all actions by the government are bad, or that power should never be used. Like I have approaches to this stuff that are not traditionally small government American conservative. So in that sense, I guess I'm more open. I guess the thing is this, like, you're right that a lot. So in like day-to-day stuff, like left-wing people tend to have no theory of mind for the right, because like the right has to understand the left because they swim in their waters. Like, yes, progressives control all the institutions, they control the language, they control education, they control media. You don't have an option to not understand left-wing concepts. Literally, you'll lose your job if you don't understand left-wing concepts and parrot them back correctly. So every right-winger has a theory of mind of the left, even if it's flawed. The left does not have to do this, right? They're not forced to. They can live their entire lives without having to actually interact with right-wing ideas. However, that does switch when you get to a certain level. There are a lot of people, like you said, who are doing, professional political commentary on the right, who just throw the word socialist around as it has no content. It's a magical word, right? It just means
just a Pokemon most of the time, right?
Yeah, I disagree with that person, right?
Yes.
So therefore, they're a socialist. And so this leads conservative people, especially people who should know better, who are like leading these people and explaining things to them and are commentating professionally about it. That leads them to blind spots like corporations. Corporations have hated conservatives for decades. They've hated traditional values. They've tried to tear the family unit apart piece by piece. And the whole time, conservatives are like, no, we got to protect corporations. Corporations are people under American law, right? Like this is the position of the right, because conservatives were more interested in kind of the ideology rather than like the actual end goal of what the people they're supposed to be taking care of. And so they were protecting corporations who hated them because that's what small government conservatives do. So in that sense, I'm very different from conservatives. I don't call myself a conservative, but most people, if you like ran into me, just would be like, oh, that's a conservative guy.
Okay. I mean, this segues perfectly into something I definitely want to ask you about, which was essentially, put it this way, here's the problem. If we talk about lenses again, if I just use the simple political spectrum lens, right? If someone says they're going to be a conservative or right-leaning, right, in the modern day, I mean, you'll know this analogy. That just looks like you're saying, my basketball team is the Washington Generals. And it's like, look, they can be your favorite basketball team if you like losing, because you're going to cheer them on and they are going to lose every single time, seemingly. And even when they get a win, I mean, this is the real joke about the modern political state of things, especially in America, right? Even the wins in the modern day, dude, is like that joke of like conservatism is like, 90s liberalism going at the speed limit. It's like, mate, this is ridiculous. Like the wins that they claim is like, guys, 5 years ago, you would have said this was a win for the other side. Like, what is this? So essentially, how do you orientate yourself in that regard? Is it you're more in the theory of conservatism? Because to me, essentially, conservatism not only doesn't conserve anything, but I even think in the modern day, people are just playing semantic games. Like if I look at those IDW guys, they are just conservatives. It's just the joke is they don't really want conservative. They just want 90s liberalism. Like Sam Harris, for example, like the joke is once upon a time, this guy was presented as like a thinker. Mate, he's probably got the most bankrupt position of anyone politically. Like even someone I despise on the left, listen, they're making their own version of progress, dude, in an alarming fashion. Like they're having success, they're doing things in the world, their ideas are manifest. People like Sam Harris are just essentially, I think, intellectual masturbation that goes nowhere. And I almost am very suspicious that perhaps that's the point. Like as far as I can tell, they're just like a nice commercial for old ideas that eventually mean you just get looped back into left-wing thinking. What are your thoughts? And pick up any aspect of that you think's interesting.
Sure. So there's a phrase that we throw around in my corner of the internet, which you might have heard of before. Cthulhu swims slowly, but he always swims to the left.
There you go.
And so the phenomenon that you're talking about here is the leftward ratchet of liberalism. So most conservatives, if you want to get like a real rock rib conservative angry, explain to them that actually all they're conserving is classical liberalism.
Yes.
And so classical liberalism is like the water in which we swim. It is the moral framework through which we in the West understand pretty much every interaction. And because of that, we have a hard time understanding it as like an ideology, right? Or a worldview. And so, conservatives, when they say we're conserving this, what they really mean is we're conserving the version of liberalism that we liked from 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 years ago, whatever it is, right? They're not actually generally advancing a fundamentally different understanding of like human relationships and political relationships and these kind of things. And this is why it seems like the right is always losing and the left is always winning, because really what you have is two halves of liberalism cracked over kind of these two current political parties, at least in the United States. The Democrats have the social parts of liberalism, and the Republicans have the economic parts of liberalism. Exactly. And you'll notice that when the Democrats are in charge, even though they talk a lot about economic justice and all this stuff, the only thing that ever seems to happen is like all the social stuff gets passed, gay marriage or transing or whatever. Like that's the stuff that gets advanced. And then when the conservatives are in charge, when the Republicans are in charge or whatever, they talk a lot about all the social stuff that they're going to roll back and they're going to protect and that kind of thing. But weirdly, the only things that ever seem to pass are like tax cuts and rights for corporations and things. And so it doesn't really matter who's in charge. Either way, this kind of liberalism advances. And so it feels like conservatives are always losing because they're just they're just behind they're just defending the last patch of liberalism. And that's why many of these centrist liberals who have now fallen into kind of, IDW conservatism, Sam Harris territory, that's why they feel so much like conservatism, because they're neocons. They're neoconservatives.
Yes.
They fell off the spear of the progressive revolution. They said, hey, wait, now the revolution is eating stuff I like. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. And now they're just doing what the conservatives from 20, 30, 40 years ago did. People forget guys like Ronald Reagan. What'd they say? I didn't leave the left left me.
Sure.
Right? Which means he still thinks he's the standard bearer of left-wing values. That's what they should be, right?
Yes.
So he's not actually conserving anything other than leftism from when he was a kid.
Because this gets to another topic, which you'll see why I actually established initially what your thoughts were on like actual fundamental texts and ideology and philosophy, as opposed to the everyday treatment of these things now. Because to me, in the modern day, it's especially the case in my field, but it's just because it's a microcosm of the bigger world. Everything to me now in politics is just optics. It's how it appears on the surface. It's what that word colloquially means. It's what that term evokes emotionally in people. There's very little substance. It seems like truth, honesty, none of these things matter. They actually seem to play against you. So I would say along these lines, I'll pick up the point there about those IDW guys. The joke to me is the only reason they don't call themselves conservative is because in the modern day politically, one of the battles that was won in terms of messaging is conservative equals right-wing equals extreme right-wing equals insert the names of certain philosophies, parties that everyone must, as almost like the social religions say, were the most evil people in history, the worst, you never should even be associated with. Essentially, they're just scared of the terminology even. And in fact, I'd even say, by the way, I'll tie this very briefly, I won't mention it much, to how UK politics works through the lens I see it, mate, which is basically this. I'm always shocked when I re-engage with UK politics, because in the UK, we have, even though technically we, at one point in time, with the dynamics, we did have like the three-party system. It's mainly a two-party system. It's mainly obviously Labour as the left-wing one and the Conservatives as the right-wing party, right? But the problem is basically, Auron, if you look into it, the notion that like the Conservatives, that they are like a right-wing party of like these things, that's like an idea, dude, from the 80s. Like it doesn't hold up at all in like this century, for example, or the 2000s onwards. Basically, the joke would be that in the UK, you just have two left-wing parties, but it's like you say, the question is just which things are you more interested in than the other one. And you're going to get certain aspects no matter what. But the mad thing is, this is the point I'm making here. If you ask the everyday person, even people who are college educated, they have legitimate jobs, they're not just a guy who's just doing some meaningless manual labor who doesn't engage with politics, they really still believe, Auron, that like if you're a left-wing voter, for example, that the Conservatives are these evil right-wing maniacs who are doing all the classic things about helping business and ruining that. They don't bother looking, for example, mate, about the fact that under the Conservatives, immigration still continues at a legal rate to insane. They don't actually look at any of the fundamentalist issues, but that they're able to make them scary, even though the joke is, as I'm alluding to, I actually don't know what you'd be getting out of the Conservative Party if you wanted some sort of right-wing politics or conservatism. They're not doing any of it. In fact, they're doing just as bad as in America. But the difference is, at least in the UK, you could maybe make that argument. I genuinely think in America, mate, people aren't even ready for that premise I just said. I mean, I'll give you an example. A few years ago, a friend of mine once said to me that when he actually saw the president before this one, see, I'm very carefully saying it that way, to him, he said to me, it was just actually like one of the first centrist presidents. And if you look at what he did stuff on both sides. Mainly, he made, obviously, his own backers' interests, like every president. But he said, actually, if you looked at it, like, you could just pick holes in all the notions, any of it was right-wing or conservative. Like, it didn't even live up to that. Hence why, you'll know this, the last 3 or 4 years have been, the battle hasn't been like, how do we defeat the left wing? The battle now is like, should we stick with that leader or should we go against him? Is he even a real conservative? Is he playing us? And is this guy the real guy? Like, what do you think on this topic? Because to me, the optics mean that people, they really think the surface is all there is and they never seem to penetrate any deeper.
Yeah, nor really should you expect them to be, to kind of go to what you were saying there, the president before last, one that might have been more orange in hue.
There you go.
He was just a blue dog Democrat, right? Like in every way. This guy was for labor protection. He had a lot of views on social issues that were more progressive than Barack Obama. When Barack Obama was first, running for office,
Sure.
he had all kinds of things that were in no way radically right wing, and yet this guy is basically the second coming of
the guy from Germany in the 30s and 40s.
A German painter.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Like that's what this guy gets treated, right?
Yes.
And how does that happen? How do you look at someone who...
And people vehemently believe it. You know this. It's not even, they're not just saying it online. They genuinely believe it.
So one of the things that happens is, like, the more radically left wing we get, the more even a mildly right correction looks insane. Right? For these people have bent reality to its breaking point, and they know deep down in their lizard brain that, like, you can't actually structure the world this way. And if it's and they know, like, if at any point they don't, like, just bend reality with all of their might, things might snap back into place. And they're terrified of that, right? Which is why, like, anytime even the most mild milquetoast Mitt Romney style Republican is up, all of a sudden they're a demon spawn from the fifth dimension, and they're immediately gonna reinstate slavery and everything's gonna
of course, all that stuff, yes,
right?
Yes.
There's a reason that they tell increasingly apocalyptic tales about increasingly benign candidates on the right, and it's because they really are at the point where, like, they've bent reality so hard that any counter narrative, any course correction, any taking the foot off the gas pedal feels like the whole thing could spin out of control. And so I think that's why you think I don't think you'll ever see this. I try to tell people, I don't want to get to the nuts and bolts of politics, but at this point, because we're keeping it more theoretical, but, like, I tell people, like, don't expect to, like, nominate some mild candidate and then, like, politics will just go back to normal.
Right.
Like that's done. It's only accelerating from here. These people don't know any other way to handle it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. We're through the looking glass in that regard. I mean, actually, you've maybe preempted something I was going to ask about then, which is another thing to do with the optics angle. But actually, I think what you're saying plays into this. So maybe I'll just set it up and see where you go with it. Is, to me, I would define it like this. This is something I've found both in my own experience being a public figure online, but also it seems like it's how it works in society now, right? As you're saying, so much of what they've done on the left wing is, like, I agree with you on some, like, instinctual level, deep down, beyond the conscious mind, everything. I do think, I agree with you. They sort of know that they're not right. And essentially, I would break it down two ways. One, I would say, in my opinion, in the modern day, the main divide in people seems to be describable like this. There's people who are like, well, here's how it should be. And they typically tend to be the left-wing people right now. And they are, as a result, willing to force and live a lie, a fantasy, just a notion that might be a beautiful idea but might not have any basis to reality. And they're willing to do everything to uphold that. Whereas I would say the other side, look, it's not as simple as painted with enormous broad strokes, but you get the premise. The other side is almost more like, here's how I think things are, whether we like it or not, and we're going to have to face it and deal with that. And then that's the reason why I see that it doesn't work for either side to talk, is to the left-wing person. If you really are saying, this is how it should be, and wouldn't it be great if it was like this? If the other person says, yeah, but things are like this, so they could say, yes, but X is X, then they don't take that as, like, right, he's just saying what reality is. They take it, oh, so that's what he wants things to be. That's what he thinks they should be. They almost, like, incorporate into their own worldview. And so one thing I would say is, to me, I would describe in the modern day, the way discourse happens is, I think that being offended or the fact that someone said something you don't like is way more important than whether what was said is right or there's honesty and good intentions behind it. Like, in the modern day, the worst thing you can do is say the emperor has no clothes. That is the ultimate sin.
Yeah, so one thing that you've already noted that I think is correct is that left and right feel like they've kind of lost some of their meaning, right?
Yes,
like it's,
absolutely.
People are constantly like, okay, this, what do these labels ever even mean anymore? The one thing I will say is I think there is one very consistent way to understand these concepts, and it's not totalizing, but if you want, like, a handy shorthand to what left and right means, like with that is actually useful rather than just a bunch of rhetoric and policy positions, I think the most useful way to understand left and right is the right believes that natural hierarchies exist, and the left believes that they shouldn't. And so,
yes, well said.
Yeah, and so people on the left are constantly trying to warp and change the world around them in a way to fit it into their worldview, the way they think things should be. They feel like they can bring the kingdom of heaven on earth, right? And this is always a mistake. This is always the danger. Every utopian regime has the same goal: bringing the kingdom of heaven on earth,
yes.
Changing this world and trying to make it perfect, and ignoring the truth about the world so that you can shape it into your ideal. Because if you want to do that, you must fundamentally break people. You must fundamentally alter them in a way that,
and maybe even kill people, as the famous adage goes,
100%.
as to why they always end up killing people in the revolution. Because that's something I, as a naive young person, never understood until someone just explained. Like, if you really did think you had the keys to paradise and there were people standing in your way, the logic goes you would be morally justified to remove them. That's the problem, isn't it?
That's exactly right. You are doing something that is essential for the betterment of your abstract group. And so, like, that's why the emperor having no clothes is so dangerous for them, because their entire, again, as they get further and further away from reality, as they bend and warp things more and more, the reassertion of natural hierarchies becomes more and more dangerous, because so many people are bought in deeply into a system that requires the fundamental altering of human nature in order to allow them to have, like, benefits and status and power and prestige that they otherwise wouldn't have. And they know that if any moment that system crumbles, everything that they have invested in will fall apart, because in the natural order of things, they wouldn't be where they are. The only way they're there is if the world is completely warped and shaped the way that they want it. And so I think that's why the emperor, someone pointing out, hey, this, actually the world doesn't work this way. Actually, this doesn't last. Actually, that person is not what you say they are. Someone doing that, it has to get more and more dangerous. They have to scream and shout it down and become more apoplectic every time, because if people stop for a minute and say, wait, actually, maybe the world doesn't work that way, then the whole thing just kind of comes apart.
When I grew up as a boy, and for just your reference, I'm 39 years old, so I'm certainly no spring chicken in that sense. So I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. When I was a boy, I don't know if this is a function of media, because admittedly, even back then, media was overwhelmingly left-wing people. And I would say even that generation was sort of like a holdover from almost like hippies and that type of thinking, if you know what I mean. Like, even their version back then of like, we're the resistance and we're going to battle these like evil right-wing, but even their version was almost a LARP back then, it felt like, right? One thing that seems to me, it's almost like some Mandela Effect shit, mate, is I swear when I was a boy growing up, it feels like society flipped, if you know what I mean. Because the UK and USA, if you don't know, by the way, I know it's like a simple pairing, but actually they seem to be fairly aligned in how things have transformed over the last like 40, 50 years and over the time. But I don't know if it's the Anglosphere and the connections, like shared language, but there seem to be parallels. And what I'll say is this, in the UK, and I get the vibe it was similar in the US, the perspective would have been back then, dude, that corporations and most politicians and all the rest of it, people would have described it the other way. They would have been like, there's like two right-wing parties and it's all just for the corporations and power and the establishment, and we're all just these plucky artists, battling against it, and we want freedom and love and, all these. And the joke was, that's why all those progressive causes seemed so vibrant and powerful and effective. And it did seem like, even though you are long past like civil rights movement, etc., you did think like, if you represent gay rights, you're some sort of fucking hero in the modern day and you're taking a stand and all this, right? Is that my own naivety that I was a young kid and I was just seeing the world through the lens of media? Do you actually think society flipped in the sense that, like, as you alluded to, in the modern day, I mean, it's why the joke when you see the SJW person is you just go like, bro, who are you rebelling against? There's no cost to you, and every single institution and backed person essentially agrees with you to some degree. Like, you're not a misaligned some hero. If anything, you are like the shock troop of the establishment. So am I wrong? Was there a flip that occurred at some point? Did we ever go through the looking glass?
I think it is, because I grew up in the same time, and I think it is looking at the past, kind of differently, right? I think it is kind of taking the media of that time more seriously than you take the media now, because it wasn't. It's the same thing. So there's this guy, Sam Francis, and he wrote this book, Leviathan and Its Enemies, and he does a really good job of explaining the professional managerial class, which I don't know how familiar you are with kind of that concept.
I understand the premise. Yeah, the notion, essentially, just to my audience, if they don't know anything, essentially it's the premise, right, that instead of actually being people with like firm philosophies that are going to do this no matter what, and they're going to try and get like, it's essentially the notion that these are people where they're put in position by establishment to just use their brand of politics to just, as you said, just to manage what happens. And essentially it's just about managing the perceptions of the public, not necessarily some sort of like all-encompassing full spectrum ideology. Is that in the vein of what you're talking about?
Well, that's certainly something they do, but it actually goes a little deeper.
Okay,
so basically what happens is there's this, I guess we'll go one thinker back, James Burnham, right? So James Burnham is a communist. He's a Trotskyite, and he kind of comes out, he's writing around World War II. And of course, there's like three big ideologies, right? There's kind of the Western liberal democracy, there's communism, and there's fascism. And he looks at all three of these ideologies, and he says everyone thinks these are three very distinct and different ideologies. But the one thing that all of these ideologies share is they're actually a transfer of power from what was kind of the bourgeoisie capitalist class to the power of managers. Basically, like all these independent capitalists who used to largely kind of have the power in Western civilization up to that point, they're shifting their power into these large corporate entities, and these large corporate entities are managed by these very specialized people, the professional managerial class, right? So the guy who owns the thing, the guy who has all the big money, he still has a lot of influence, but his day-to-day operations are being handed over to people who are specialized in finance and advertising and corporate, HR and all this stuff, right? And they're actually, as their importance increases and the ownership class's importance decreases, it's the managerial class that are actually taking on more and more of the power, right? And so he says, whether you're looking at any of those three big ideologies of the world at that time, all of them are looking at like basically top-down central planning of economies through managers, right? Like whether you're FDR or mid-century German painter or Stalin, they're all looking at controlling their countries through like basically top-down economic management. And so what Sam Francis does is he expands on this idea, and he basically says the reason in America that we thought that the corporations were opposed by the liberal vanguard, by like the progressive vanguard, is that what actually happened is that managers, like the managerial class of that were like running corporations and institutions, and the vanguard political class, they had the same goals, they had the same ends and interests in mind, but the progressives, the vanguard, the radical progressives, did not understand that. They thought that these people, because they were not moving fast enough, were enemies. So the professional managerial class had more self-control. They didn't want to boil the frog and kill it immediately. They wanted to boil it slowly. The progressives wanted it to happen right now.
Right. Yes.
And so that's why they saw themselves as enemies, even though they are actually moving towards the same thing. And so what has happened over time is not that there's been a flip per se. What you're perceiving is the managerial class catching up with the vanguard progressive class. So now that their interests are more obviously overlapped, which is why people who say they're like, democratic socialists or whatever, have the same values as the people who run Apple and Amazon, right? Because what happened is just that the corporate class caught up with the progressive vanguards. Nothing flipped. The natural flow finally, these two circles overlapped, and they know now they can move in sync rather than pushing against each other.
Yes, I would even say, to pick up what you're talking about there, like an obvious analogy I can, or reference I can draw to, because it's just from UK politics, is if people know the concept of Fabianism, which was heavily influential on people like Tony Blair and the New Labour Party, where basically it comes from the Roman general Fabian, where his premise was, instead of just like all out like battling someone and trying to beat them in war, he was a guy who liked to do things like long drawn out sieges, where you just get them to be so starved out eventually you just sort of, it's the joke of like, you can just sort of win by doing nothing at the end because the enemy's defeated. And essentially I've heard a similar kind of lens applied to 20th century history like you're talking about, which is the premise was there was these elite figures at the beginning and they had an idea of what they wanted society to be, and the only dispute was, like you're saying, do we get guns and do it tomorrow and just force people to, or the Fabian approach is more like it's insidious. It's the idea that you manipulate every like surrounding element and you manipulate what the words mean and you gradually move people. It's like the boil the frog premise basically. And the joke would be, even though they present the 20th century as these two totally diametrically opposed enemies battled, and if anything it was just two sets of people who disagreed on how to get to the same point, it seems like.
Well, and your historical references is even better, actually, because what happens with Fabian is that the Senate wants to remove him because even though he's winning too slowly. Right. And so like it's the same thing with the progressive, like, well, we have the same goal and this is working, but we want it to happen faster. So you're actually a problem. Right. And so this was the tension that existed beforehand. When we thought that the left was battling the evil corporate right or whatever when we were kids, right?
Yes.
But what's actually is happening is actually the progressive vanguard was just nipping at the heels of a corporate movement that was already moving in a left-wing direction. And so what happens, like I said, is that they just end up catching up with each other.
One thing I would ask about is another area I find always makes any bigger political discussion boring is when people act like there are distinct sides that have no overlap. And especially if it becomes so simplistic, it is capitalism, which I notice no one ever defines, versus socialism, which they just define as everything I don't like / communism 2.0. Like there's no depth there whatsoever. So like another question I would have, and I've noticed it's a central part of seemingly most of the theory discussions you have, is like, these aren't really like, distinct operating systems that have no overlap. Like, if anything, these are also lenses in a way. Like they're like, I mean, it's not, I'm not making a revolutionary point here. You can obviously have socialist policies and techniques within capitalist approaches, similar to how I'm sure the obvious critique people make of capitalism is it's not really capitalism, it's crony capitalism, which is actually historically, again, from the UK, it's more similar to sort of mercantilism and some of the things that were going on back then. So what would you say to this, like the notion that even though, like, look, there's a separate societal issue of can ideas that don't always agree get along, which I think you could get into, it's never one or the other, right? It's some sort of mixture, or like, is it a buffet you can pick from? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, especially if you look at something like capitalism versus socialism, what you always have is mixed economies, right? Like, there is no such thing as, if there is a state, that state will be involved in your economy, full stop.
Yes.
Like, and that's going to make, like, that'll make, again, small government conservatives, they'll lose your mind. Like, what are you talking about? Like, sorry, man, free market, it's not a thing. Like, that's not real. Like, if you have a state, if there are people with guns who manage the day-to-day goings on inside your society, which there always will be, if we want to get into that, but like, if that exists, then your economic interactions will never be completely free. They're on a continuum. Some of them will be more free market than others, but the idea that there'll just never be a thumb on the scale from the government is ludicrous. Like, that is as utopian as
yeah, it is wild, isn't it?
Yeah, it's as utopian as any communism. Like,
yes.
Sorry, like the state will never perfectly manage your economy, and you will never have an economy with no interference from the state. Both of these ideas are on either end absolutely ridiculous. But what happens is, again, most people, and let's be really clear here. I am not bagging on anyone. I am not saying, oh, how can you not take the time to like read about the stuff and make this your life and memorize it? Like, most people, they got jobs, they need to raise their kids, they need to get the car fixed, they got to get like most people don't want to rule. Most people don't want to do this on a day-to-day basis. They've been told they have to. They've been told it's their duty. They've been told it's a key part of their existence as someone in a Western liberal democracy. Most people don't want to spend time breaking all of this stuff apart, and that's okay. You shouldn't have to. And so it's in no way discrediting to someone if they don't understand like every nuance of like economic policy or something. That's fine. But the thing is, like, when we have the edutainment, like you're talking about, like when we have commentators and newspapers and magazines and YouTube people, and like their job is to like just rile people up and break it down, make it as simple as possible, and like turn it in, then of course this stuff's going to get lost. Like, nuance is the enemy of this thing, right? It's not your friend. Like, if in a democratic system, you don't want your voters to understand the other side. That's a problem for you. If your voters understand a side, they're more likely to vote for that person. They're more likely to defect from you. The side who better controls the understanding of their voters is the one that wins under popular sovereignty. That's, understanding the other side is a bad thing, not an asset when it comes to compelling people to do what you want them to do.
One of the problems I feel like when you try to talk to, look, again, I'm using colloquial terms here, so we'll just accept that these are flawed concepts. When I say I talk to normal people, the people you're talking about, the people who've got better things to do, they read a book, they have to fix the car, put the kids to bed, do a mind-numbing job maybe that they don't want to do, but to provide for their family. Those people, right? When you try to explain to some of those people, because here's what I think's wild. The problem with being on Twitter is you really do get gaslit into like these extreme positions are like the normal positions of everyone who's on either very broad political spectrum, whereas clearly they aren't. Like, if you go and talk to normal people, mostly they're actually totally unaware of most of these discussions. A lot of them, some of them haven't even noticed that anything has changed. Like, they wouldn't ask that question I asked about did things flip. They still believe the fake version that it is just all evil, right-wing corporate power and all that, and that the left-wing person is the hero and all the rest of the jazz. But the area I wish I could get through to them is I just want to explain to them on a very simple level with my own very flawed, simplistic understanding, which goes like this. I'm not against the idea, like I've said, that there are brilliant left-wing thinkers, there are great ideas, there's techniques we can use, there are things that, like, obviously I'm into ideas like the idea of community, or the idea that, you might want to all contribute towards some sort of social good. These aren't terrible ideas on their face, whether I agree with them, theoretically or not. I could see also practically how things could be used that maybe aren't the most perfect theoretical idea. But one area I often want to try and get through to people, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone do this, is I want to just tell the people who are more normal and who don't get it, like they really do get tricked, like I say, by the optics, and they do think that when someone wants in school, for example, to teach their kids certain ideas, no, that's still part of a progressive, brilliant idea of like individual freedom, and you can express who you are, and this is a brilliant culture that allows these things. But the joke is, I want to tell them, like, yes, but the people doing that, their express ideology, if you go and read it and you listen to them, is that they do not believe, like you've said, in any sort of natural hierarchy. So they essentially believe you have to just make your own artificial one to get your own ends. And more importantly, their ideology comes as a feature with the notion that you can essentially change all labels, so you can take like what a child is, what a teacher is, what a parent is. You can change those labels. They're not what they traditionally meant. And more importantly, they fundamentally believe the state should decide and manage all of these things. So spoiler, it's not that now some nut is coming for your kids. Now someone's coming and they're going to force these things. This was always the end. As far as I can tell, we were always getting to this stop on the line, as it were. Do you get what I mean?
So there's this great book by C.S. Lewis called The Abolition of Man. And in the book, C.S. Lewis explains that, like, over time, educators can kind of beat natural reactions and kind of just the humanity out of students. And if you like do this long enough and you iterate this continuously, you can like remove the kind of like all the natural responses and impulses of a human so that you can kind of shape them the direction you want to. And he says at the end of this line, what happens is you get the abolition of man. Like, once you have a generation that is completely shaped in all of its impulses and all of its understandings artificially, then that's the end of the human race, because the generation after it will not know what authentic humanity looked like. Right. The famous line from the book is, we make men without chests, and then we remove the organ and demand the function. If we remove the natural impulses of humanity and then stand around wondering why no one, like, say, stands up for people and fights for things and has courage and honor and those kind of things, it's because you stripped those things piece by piece out of humans and then expected them to retain the things you liked. And that's what you're talking about here. There have been generations of people whose natural instincts were beaten down and suppressed by this really ugly artificial attempt to shape humanity into something it's not. And so what happens is that this process that's been happening for many, many decades finally gets to its last part. We're finally arriving to the end, the abolition of man, and all of a sudden people are like, whoa, what happened? What's going on? It's like the thing that's been going on for years, the thing that happened to you and your parents and probably your grandparents, and the only reason you're noticing it is the thing that they're producing, the thing they're trying to shape your child into, is basically like not human anymore. And all of a sudden your warning lights are finally going off. The frog is boiled at this point, right? To go back to our metaphor. And that's what people are noticing. They think they're at the end, or they think they're at the beginning of a revolution. We get these IDW people. Oh, the left went too far. Wokeness exploded 8 years ago. No, you're at the end of the revolution. You're at the bottom. Like the things are coming to fruition that have been seeded into your society for a very long time. That's what you're observing.
What about, another thing I've always found, right? This is like a broad topic, so I'll see how I enter this one. Basically, one of the observations people have made in the modern day, which again seems to be a line along people who are politically divided, is essentially like the function of traditional religions. And I explicitly say traditional there, as in ones that essentially were the operating system of your culture, whether recently or in like decades past, or traditionally thought to have been, is I actually think it returns to what I said at the beginning about the concept of like, what are you basing it on? Is it right? Is it from some God? Is it efficacious? Like, I would say, even this, I'll put it this way, my own position is a really weird one, Auron. I don't know if you yourself are Christian. Would you describe yourself as Christian?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Right, I sort of assumed as much by the sorts of philosophy you're into and the people you. Here's what's weird is I very much like in Anglosphere countries, like I'm from the UK, if I'm talking to an American, that's the position I most identify with. Like I would agree, like put it this way, if we all laid down things we agree about life and what is good and what is bad and what is beautiful and what is good, I think we'd have a lot of shared overlap value. But I just don't literally believe in Christ and salvation and that sort of thing. I maybe do as a more abstract principle of like personal development or what the human soul can endeavor to become or something like that. But essentially what I'm getting to is the reason why I also align with that is I do think whether the actual trappings of the specific religion are right or not, I can only speak from my own culture. I can't know what it's like to be an Indian in India, Chinese guy in China, etc. So I can only speak from my own position. But essentially there is some efficacy within that philosophy as far as I can tell, Auron. Like if I had to pick secular philosophies, the Sam Harris approach or some progressive approach, or even some sort of Christian religion, which I might not literally agree with as like a factual thing, I think I'd easily pick the latter. What do you think to this topic? Because essentially I'm sort of asking about the idea that like this is like the observation everyone's made is ideology, like things like progressivism, have replaced religion in people's brains as like the operating system. But I'd even go the other way and say that to me, these religions almost, that is what they served the purpose for initially themselves. They were an operating system, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think you find yourself in a position that a lot of people do. I've talked to many people who kind of express your feelings on this, and I think you're hitting on, the thing that is really essential. Tradition, religious or non, though all, tradition has some religious aspect in it, but tradition is the knowledge of your civilization that has been encoded and passed down to you. It's the lessons that your civilization learned, usually at very high costs. and needed to transmit in a way that would like be deep and meaningful, not in like, hey, you learn this like, quadratic equations, like in a way that is pretty fundamental to your day-to-day interactions, right? Like traditions are things that inform pretty much everything about who we are. They define our identity. They tell us how to treat people, who we should be interacting with, what the goals of our life are. And so when we ignore tradition, we are ignoring these things and thinking, well, I can like completely figure this out on my own, right? Like I don't all these many thousands of years of understanding, I'm just way smarter than the collective wisdom of my entire civilization. I can go do this on my own. And that's really, really attractive to teenagers, right? Like we've all been there. Like every one of us did that, right? I don't need this. What do my mom and dad know? Blah, 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 right? Like we all do this. The problem is that actually no one determines this stuff for themselves. Like no one completely. Identity is not something that you construct a priori. It's not something that you can create alone. And so if you're not plugged into your tradition, if you're not plugged into your religion, you will fill it with someone else's. Like you like some other collective identity and worldview will invade and inform who you are. The lie that both the left and the right tell people is that like you are a complete individual who makes all of your decisions on your own. Your identity is completely restricted by you. That is false.
They suggest you can basically choose you can choose a la carte who you are, right?
Yeah, and you cannot do that, right? And so everything, that's why, for instance, even if you don't believe in like the literal deity of the Bible, you and I would largely agree on like end goals for life and like the way to treat people and what's best for families and stuff, because and I'm sure you're aware of this, your morality is informed by Christianity.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Right. There's a book by Tom Holland called Dominion, where he goes through the historical just explaining to people like why history kind of shows you that the Western understanding of culture and morality is uniquely Christian. Put
it this way, that was the area I thought those new atheist guys failed the hardest in, was when they tried to argue that like you could have all the brilliant philosophy and thought and thinking of the Western civilization with none of the Christianity.
Yeah, and so here's the thing, and this is the problem that like maybe yourself, you might arrive at, right? Because I've talked to again a lot of people who have this problem. What happens a lot of times is I talk to people and they're like, well, what we need is like a new religion that we can all agree on and like kind of figure things out. But like the problem is that you can't just like pick this thing, right? Like the thing that gives religion its magic, the thing that creates the social cohesion, the fabric, the continuity, the willingness to cooperate and work towards a shared goal is a genuine pursuit of this thing, right? Like religion, it lengthens time preference, right? It makes people less interested in obtaining things right now, because there are goals beyond them, right? Their family, their culture, their God matters more than like their immediate gratification.
Yes,
civilization is built on these things. People are meant to function around churches, and so one of the things that I would encourage anyone to do who's in this spot, who's like, I find myself drawn to these values, but I can't like immediately plug in. Put yourself in those actions, go to services, observe rituals, help others, be involved in your community, share those things with other people. Don't try, I'm not saying turn off your brain. Like there's lots of great, very intelligent people who explain why Christianity is true, factually, philosophically, all kinds of things. I'm not going to waste anyone's time trying to run all those sources down. But as compelling as all those things are, and they exist there for you, actually get involved in a community, plug in, like make those things manifest in your real life. That's what makes these things work. And I think that's what binds a society together, is when you're actually involved in perpetuating these traditions in real life. I think that's what really gives you that value and makes it something that's indispensable.
Because one thing to me that is it's almost a corollary point when you note that ideologies in the modern day, especially in people lacking any religion, just seem to overlay the same almost circuit in the brain that religion takes up. Again, I'm using mixed metaphors here, but you get what I mean. The reason why that observation to me isn't actually drawn out enough, there's another thing people do. They not only do the single factor analysis, the surface level analysis, they never then think, right, let me take this idea to its nth degree. Let me push it through and see where it goes and where it comes from. And in not doing so, they seem to miss a lot of points. So another thing I actually find quite alarming about the fact that I would say progressivism is the new religion of the Western countries and civilizations, is built into that in the same way as in religious thinking. There are heretical ideas, and you certainly don't in religion just go, well, you can have your heretical ideas and just live side by side. It's all good. Those are what people go to war for and kill each other over and are the worst things possible. So one of the things I have to say I find quite alarming is when I grew up as well, they really were in public debates. It really was like, I mean, you don't have this term in America, but in England, basically, before you go to college, which is not the thing you call university, it's the thing between university and the end of high school, basically, for you. There's a thing called sixth form, which is like an extra year you can sort of do if you're one of the smart kids, basically. And that's exactly where you can already imagine. It's like the freshman at college that in America. That's the guy that's got the beret on, and then there's the guy that does poetry, and then there's a guy that's reading fucking Kropotkin, and you know what I mean? Like they're essentially people trying to find their identity through politics, through meaning, and they're all the stereotypes you'd imagine, right? When you get to this level of thinking, I actually, back then, you really could have these discussions, dude. You could have wide open discussions about wild topics like crazy, what do we think about this thing that in theory was bad in history and that? And you could just have the discussion and it ended there. But in the modern day, where I see the religion has become entrenched, is like, the notion of democracy, especially in America, mate, from what I see, that's a holy idea. That is like a fundamental part of the progressive religion, to the extent that people do almost like some 1984 shit. The Washington Post's headline banner is mad sinister if you think about how they apply it. Like, democracy dies. Like, without us, there's no democracy. Basically, if you believe us or you don't believe in democracy, then you look at, like, you're not even allowed to, like, approach infringing upon this idea. In fact, every major American politician will say, they'll constantly spam the word democracy. Well, yeah, democratic country, we're a liberal democracy. Democracy is important. Democratic values. And the reason I came to this and why I'm setting it up this way is one of the epiphanies I had when I sort of realized that the traditional religions were way closer to leading to the world I would want, the outputs that I would want, is that actually that's why they're going to contrast so hard with progressive values. Because essentially, if you think about it politically, what Christian religion is it's the ultimate hierarchy, but it's monarchical. Obviously, the monarch is God. And he doesn't have to share his power. He can delegate to someone below him if he chooses. And it's almost, the joke is, this is why I wonder how much of the way the brain actually works and humans socially function isn't like designed or chosen. I mean, designed by humans artificially. I almost feel like we are almost a computer with certain circuits. Because I would say essentially, if you look at most Christian religious thinking of that Christian hierarchy spiritually above humans with the powers of principalities, dude, it's basically just like Britain, like 600 years ago or something, or during the time when you had the barons and the lords and all that, that sort of thing. Like, to me, it's more like that. So to me, it will always clash with progressivism because they're trying to remove those hierarchies. They're trying to say they don't exist. So to me, in a sense, Christianity is the ultimate monarchy, if you know what I mean. It's why I often say my political position, it's not, I didn't invent the phrases. I'm like a monarchist. I'm just not a royalist with the specific royal family of England, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's a guy, Carl Schmitt, and he made a very similar observation. He said that political forms mimic basically theological concepts, right? Like, literally the name of his book was Political Theology. And so, like you said, like the function of like a monarchical state mirrors more closely the kind of traditional understanding of, say, like Christianity or many theistic traditions where like the order comes from God and it goes to the ruler, and the ruler can make decisions and take mercy on someone in the same way that God does. The law flows from the word of the ruler. The authority comes down. So like these are parallels we can see very easily. And then he says like, basically the advent of constitutional democracy was very heavily influenced by deism, which is something that was more popular among some of the American founders, though I would still argue they were largely Christian. But basically it's the attempt to like remove the interventions of God from like the regular interactions of people, right?
The joke is it almost is a secular approach to Christianity, as mad as that sounds, right?
It's exactly what it is. It's a secularization of Christianity. And he says this is basically why democracy feels this way, is like basically in the same way that like a deist was trying to remove the miracle, right? Remove the intervention of God from the day-to-day operation of the universe. The constitutional democracy was attempting to remove the special decision, right? And instead make things about systems that are understandable and controlled by man, right? And so the reason democracy feels like this is that that's exactly what it is, right? That was the purpose that we want this, right? As people, we want to feel in charge. We want to think we're making our decisions, even though we don't want to like run the whole thing where we don't actually want to rule. We want to feel like we have freedom and liberty. Yes. And so when we don't have a monarch and when instead we have a democracy, we feel like, okay, I am involved in the decisions. And at the end of the day, it's a systems that are set up, right? There's this very carefully designed set of systems that all check and balance each other. And that's what actually determines what happens. No one individual person makes those decisions, right? It's the system that governs me. And so I am in essence free because of that. But what we find is eventually, like, actually the manipulation of systems is its own skill, and that a ruling elite who understands how to properly and continuously manipulate systems is one that's going to get much better at like constantly staying power in a given democracy. And that's why so many people feel like democracy has degenerated into oligarchy, because that's literally what it does, what it always does, because oligarchs are always going to be better at manipulating the mass opinions of the people. If popular sovereignty is your legitimating mechanism, if it's the thing that grants legitimacy and power to your government, then the control of popular opinion will be the key lever by which you can stay in power. The people
it's just the obvious bias, right? I mean, like you're saying, if I have loads of money and in theory we're in a system where we each get a vote, why don't I use my money to influence you and a bunch of other people to vote the way I want?
Yeah.
Just logical, right?
And in fact, again, this is something like conservatives fight to the death.
Yes.
Right? Like, of course, this like multi-billionaire from outside my country has the right to pour unlimited funds into my country to make sure that the votes in my country go in a particular way, right? Like, it sounds ludicrous, but this is what people go to bat for every single day on what is supposed to be called the right. And so, this warping of the system, this ability to constantly manipulate the system, means that actually at the end of the day, someone is still deciding, right? Like, we never actually got away from the idea that like actually the government will decide, like those who operate the state will make decisions and will have authority. Like, sovereignty is conserved. It continues to exist. The only question is it out in front where everyone can see it and understand where it comes from, like a monarchy? Or is it obfuscated? Is it dispersed into a system, an oligarchy, which is harder to grasp power on? We never get rid of the power. The question is just, where is it? Where does it lie?
Yes. One thing I would like to ask about is one of the reasons, it's why I know, listen, this is a naive thing to say, but essentially I'll say the stupid way. Like, I sort of want people to think the way I think, Auron, because I think it makes sense, even though I realize that is a ridiculous thing to say on the surface. But I mean it in this sense, that when people pick whatever side they're on, whatever party they're with, whatever personally, even if they think they have policies they want enacted, one of the things I find so disappointing is they never seem to actually ask themselves, do I ever get the outputs I want from these inputs? And so they do end up just going on the same carousel over and over again. Like, I'll give you an example. One of the things to me, I'm someone who likes to read a lot of sources that aren't, let's say, authorized or official about history and politics. And that's a clever way to get around saying the dreaded term we all know. Basically, when I like to look into those areas, I already have accepted the notion that, like, none of these political parties are what they seem. They're certainly not accomplishing the ends they pretend to. Some of that is marketing. Some of it is social religion. And essentially, one thing I would say as an example is this: whatever your particular dream thing that the government could do, it could be, let's just pick some classics that everyone claims they want, and collectively everyone claims they want these things. They want to feed the poor, they want to help veterans of the military, they want to, like, let's say they want their version of an immigration balance, etc. Now, one thing I would say is, nobody is getting their way out of normal people. Doesn't matter how left-wing you are, doesn't matter how right-wing you are, doesn't matter how centrist you are. You're not even getting you're not even getting anything that was on the menu, as it were, in that sense. And one of the reasons why, to me, I'm shocked more people aren't alarmed, is I'll give you the very brief example I would give, which is, to me, the bailouts I have seen in my own lifetime for the financial industry, the medical industry, stock markets. When I look at the bailouts that have happened, Auron, they actually, and the amount of money being printed in the US, for example, they prove that these goals would have been attained the next day if these people in power had actually wanted it. They clearly did not. They were selling you the notion they were going to do. I mean, people might have seen recently, the most recent president, for example, he actually has a tell which gives away everything. He always says, like, essentially, like, this thing should be done, if he doesn't plan on actually doing it. He's just again reminding you, like, I'm the guy who says we should do this. It's like, well, are you going to do it then? It's like, no, just like in the president before, some conservatives have figured out now, Auron could have done a whole bunch of things by executive decision. He just didn't do it. He chose not to do it. He expressly decided not to do some of the things he could have done from day one and at any point in time. So essentially, to me, bailouts just show the mask is off. It just shows that, like, they can find and spend any amount of money for anything they and their backers and masters want. And the joke is, it's not that they don't have the money for you. They will never have the money for you. That's not even what they're there for, as far as I can tell. What do you think to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's largely true, right? Like, the trick is that if the order moves in the direction that power wants, anything is possible. And if the order doesn't move in the direction that power wants, then it's completely, everyone's incapable of doing it. So, for instance, to give a more specific example, they're passing a omnibus spending bill, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of American politics, but they're spending a lot of money, right? And in this bill, there's like $60-something billion for the war in Ukraine, right? They could not find $5 billion just a few years ago under Orange president for a border wall. Right.
There you go. Perfect example. Yes.
It's the GOP. They're supporting this. They're on board with it. But they couldn't find $5 billion for one project. They can find $60 billion for another.
What does that infer?
It shows you what they really want, right? It shows where their interests really lie. And that's the problem, is a lot of people, because we are in denial, because democracy obfuscates our understanding of power, we lie to ourselves about being ruled. And because we lie to ourselves about being ruled, we lie to ourselves about the presence of a ruling class. Yes. And if you don't understand that you have a ruling class, then you don't understand that that class might have its own interests, right? And all ruling class, every civilization throughout history has been ruled, and has been ruled by an elite class. And throughout civilization, those elite classes have always held interests that are somewhat different than the people, right? Like, everyone knows this. But because the what's the word I'm looking for here? Because the incentive for the ruling class was aligned with, in some ways, the prosperity of the people, even if there were things that were specifically good for that ruling class, in general, their actions had to, in some way, benefit the people. If they
I mean,
didn't,
put it
was
this way, to just try and pass what you're saying for someone who's very casual who's listening, are you saying something along the lines of, like, for example, if some, like, industrialist, no matter how evil you might imagine him, pick whoever you want, pick all the dreaded names, pick some industrialist 100, 150 years ago, as long as he thought, for example, if he was American, well, I am an American and I have American values, on some level, there's going to be accidental overlap anyway with what you and me want. Whereas the difference is, I would say in the modern day, the people who expressly think of themselves as, let's say, world citizens or something, they don't actually have to have any connection to what you and I want in life, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you look at like Ford, right? Like he creates the 8-hour workday, and like all the other industrialists had been burning their employees to the ground with much more appalling conditions. And Ford figures out that like actually by treating the workers better, even if he doesn't care about the workers at all, like he gets a better product and he gets more production, right? Right. So like the interest of the people, even if he's completely cynical and has no interest in, like, he didn't care if these people caught fire tomorrow, like making sure that they produce better for him by like not actually being worked to the bone every single day is better for him. So he makes the decision in favor of these people, right? Even if that's not his initial understanding. What you want is leaders whose prosperity is based on your prosperity. You want your interests aligned. So even if that leader isn't particularly like invested in you as a human, them doing better, them having more money, them having more power, them having more prestige is based on your well-being. And when those interests are aligned, your leaders are more likely to produce a civilization that benefits everyone, even if it benefits them more, because it always will. At least it benefits everybody. When they're misaligned, when power is obfuscated, when you don't know the interests of your ruling class and you don't know where their benefits come from and you don't know where their allegiances lie, then they can abuse the people. They can make decisions that are completely at odds with the interests of the people and not be held accountable. I mean, people could make those decisions in, say, a monarchy, but it became very clear to the people who were being run into the ground, like who was doing it to them, right? Yes. And then like consequences followed. But when you have a situation where those people don't understand who's making those demands on them, and they don't understand why, and they don't understand who's
and they're intentionally obfuscated, right? Like we're not supposed to be able to see who's pulling the levers, right?
Exactly. And so when those things are done, then there's no way to hold them accountable. There's no way to understand where that's coming from. And so that is a huge problem, is when the incentives do not line up, when the interests do not line up, when they are allowed to be hidden behind the curtain, we lose the natural ability of the people and their good to be served by leaders who, again, may not care about them personally, individually, but do want to see the dominion under their control flourish, because that in turn benefits them.
One of the fascinating changes I've seen in society and how people express themselves has got to be, I would say, that so many people, it's easy to convince them nowadays that there are no hierarchies, whether they're meaningful artificial ones, whether you're implying it's a natural one, whether you're trying there's a spiritual dimension. It's so easy to convince them that none of these things exist and that everything is whatever you want it to be and whatever the progress says and all the rest of that jazz. And one of the reasons, that just a pure speculation, that I always thought about myself is, if you notice in the modern day, especially countries like ours, that essentially the workforce nowadays has become some sort of meta workforce. Like, it is all office work. It is all pushing a pencil around a page. It is just bashing things and looking at numbers on a screen. It isn't any connection to something I would say is essentially real. Like, you're not working the land. You're not a soldier at war. You're not a guy on a boat somewhere as a crewman or something. You're not doing anything that interacts directly with reality. Because if you interact directly with the reality, I mean, go and spend a week on a farm somewhere if you want to find this out. You can't avoid reality. Like, reality will slap you in the fucking face every day, and you will actually find that, like, it doesn't matter what wonderful flowery ideas you have. I'll give you an example. One of the things when I was a boy, I remember reading a Seamus Heaney poem, and in this poem, he talks about how life's different on farms from, like, city life, basically. And one of the things he says, basically, is, like, it's essentially the notion that if you have, like, a bunch of kittens on a farm, you do have to put them in a sack and drown them, because you just don't have time to care for them and raise them, and they're going to breed more, and they're going to get out of control. And so even though that seems like a horrible thing to a city guy who has a cat of his own. That's reality on a farm. And if you know how a farm works and a lot of things in nature, unless you follow very strict guidelines, if people don't know, like I had family who were farmers, to be a farmer isn't like, right, I did a pretty good job, guys, so here's like 70% of the crops. It's like you either succeed and you kill it, or you just all die and it all goes really horribly, and that winter you don't live. Like there's no sort of like grounds for almost nonsense ideas to persist, if you know what I mean. And in the modern day, it seems like the workforce isn't that. Modern people, when they talk about these things, have no conceptions of these things. And in fact, to me, the example of this in America is that really weird divide you have where the city people make it sound like they, because they drink a Starbucks, have an Apple phone and drive a Tesla, they're somehow like the important person in society. But the idiot flyover farmers, some idiot that, you know when they do that thing where they themselves sort of be like, maybe we should have a sort of national divorce. It's like, bro, they have all the food, the techniques to get the food and the guns. Like, what are you going to do with your iPhone and your Bitcoin? You know what I mean? Like, it just seems like you're detached from reality at that point. What do you think on this topic?
Well, I think that as societies develop and they move away from the land and towards, urbanization in cities, they create systems, and those systems are abstracted from your actual existence, right? Like you're not going out and, killing the chicken you need to eat. Someone does it for you. You're not out there drilling for the oil that drives your car. Someone figures that out for you. And so you're abstracted from the actual deriving of those things from the land. And then like what happens is more and more of city life becomes about the maintenance of those abstraction than it does about the actual extraction of like the things you need to survive. And so people get further and further abstracted from the real day-to-day things that like make life possible. And I think once you get abstract enough, it becomes really easy to forget that those things aren't automatic and they actually don't just show up, which is why like you've probably noticed that truckers have had a really effective thing where they protest, right? Like even though unfortunately they didn't bear fruit in many of these places, like they are working class people that are able to kind of arrest civilization right where they start, because they're the pipeline between the land and the like civilization proper. And if they can throw themselves onto the gears of society, then like it turns out food doesn't actually come from your supermarket. That's not where food comes from. And if you get rid of the things that make that possible, then you kind of starve. But again, like it's people who have lived in existence that are abstracted constantly from that. They can't grasp it. They don't know how, and they think they're morally superior for like maintaining abstractions rather than actually extracting the necessary resources from the land. They can't imagine shooting an animal for food. They can't imagine that kind of thing, right? That's horrific. That somebody with more low morals is necessary to do that for them. And so I think it's just a natural flow of society. I think pretty much every society goes through this. In fact, you can even look throughout history, civilizations, right, like Rome, eventually consume so much of their like area into their metropolitanism that they have to search for places like Egypt to grow their grain for them, right? Because like so eventually they have to move the like extraction of resources outside, which again, like this was the process of colonialism for so many Western countries, right? Like they needed to move that process outside of their own domain so that they can have more and more abstract things built into it. I don't think this is particular to any one civilization. I don't think this is particular to any time or system. It's not capitalism. It's just it's just what happens. It's the cyclical nature of history. Like as civilizations build, they abstract themselves away from the land. They become more urbanized. The urbanized people forget where these things come from. They take them for granted, and they move the production further and further away from the power centers. And eventually, they get too far away. They lose control of them, and things kind of fall apart.
Right. I have a last topic I want to broach here, but I'm going to be very careful how I phrase it. But I think we've had a good convo so far. I think you're going to get the gist of what I mean. Basically, there's a One thing I would say is very interesting, I've noticed as a modern phenomenon is people, this is why I really do think, like I said earlier, that like what all the things that people think they're accomplishing secularly are just overwriting like religious circuits in the brain or fitting a similar model. Because basically people will use quotes now, and then when they show you the quote, I almost want to say to them, okay, that's a quote, like what about it? Because the problem is, like, if we're just treating it as some meta-contextual thing, yeah, maybe it's a nice quote, maybe it's a clever way to say it, but I don't think they realise the reason a quote from the Bible means something is if you are Christian, you believe God transmitted that message. That's why it's meaningful when you quote something from the Bible. But people will in the modern day, dude, quote things that are just famous sayings by just a guy, and even worse, they'll quote things from fiction that are just a character in fiction. Like, I'll give you an example. People will use that one from Game of Thrones where they're like, you know, any man who must say he is a king is no king at all. Like, I have people say that to me all the time, right? And I'm like, you know, by that logic, Muhammad Ali wasn't actually the greatest boxer then, because he said he was the greatest. But yet everyone agrees he is. So, like, what that shows is we've actually put in the place of, like, religious scripture anything we want. So one thing I would say is this, is a similar quote like that I always hear quoted as though it was like some law of the universe. And you'll know it. It's the very famous Hanlon's razor, where it says, never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. And this might be an area, I'll see, Auron, I don't know, where maybe we'll disagree. Because basically, most people I know who are just normal people agree with that sentence, that theory. They agree that in the majority of cases, it's what they call the cock-up theory of history. It's not that there's anything sinister going on. There aren't sinister forces and groups and interests, and there aren't agendas, and there aren't these like long drawn-out plans and things that go over the lifetimes and between different countries. Instead, what it is in most cases, people do things for their own reasons, their own selfish reasons, don't think. And what happens is there's a lot of incompetent people, they fuck up, and even though something might look like, oh, coincidentally, this is that way. Essentially, my perspective is there aren't coincidences. Like, they would say there are. Everything's a coincidence. I think there aren't. So basically, what I would say is this. One of the things that drew me to the conclusion that I think it's the opposite, and in most cases, it's something like people conspiring, it is malice, it is intentional, is sort of that like famous saying of, is something a feature or a bug? I actually think that the supposed incompetence that is baked into all these political regimes in the West is intentionally the feature of that is to look incompetent. Like, I'll give you an example. If I talk to a random guy in the street or a relative of mine, the thing that they seem to vibe with the most is that they can always come to the conclusion, this guy's a bloody idiot, isn't he? This leader's an idiot. Like, no, he's just incompetent. You know, what was his background? Like, he's cocked it up again. They said they'd do this. It cost them 4 million. It's going to cost 10 million now. And I notice that just allows them emotionally to process it. And then they're fine with it. They're sort of like, right, essentially, I'm allowed to think I'm actually in some weird sense smarter than this guy. He's an idiot. And somehow, it's like that line everyone says about American politics that kills me, dude, where they always say that, like, this is where you know someone's the most ridiculous normie ever. You know, when they say that line, they before every election in America, they go, huh, what does it say about the country if these are the two best people we could design? It's like, what are you talking about? What fucking, first of all, you know how short the shortlist was. And then secondly, in no universe was the selection process finding the best people in America. And the joke is, I genuinely do think, like, essentially history is a game of the Washington Generals against the Harlem Globetrotters, except, like, in my scenario, yes, someone's already decided the score and they're playing it out, and the joke is I'm just the mark who gets to decide which team to cheer for, right? I've been very careful how I phrase that, because here's the difference between me and you, mate. Some of these things could backlash on me, but I am just a guy in esports. You are a guy in politics, so I know it's the dreaded conspiracy theory term is it's one that's very ominous if it gets associated with it. So it's up to you how you address this. What would you say to that? Where are you on this spectrum? Like, how much of it is malice and how much is stupidity?
Oh yeah, no, don't worry about it. I'm on board with this topic. So
okay.
Yeah, the Hanlon's razor has taken a phenomenal number of L's as of late, right? Like,
yes.
you have to look at everything that has happened through recent elections and recent, let's say, medical emergencies.
Yes.
and this kind of stuff, and it all lines up one way over and over again. And like you said, like, you can have this outlook that, like, yeah, my opponents have won 1,000 games in a row. Geez, I mean, they really are idiots. I mean, how could they keep messing things up in their favor every single time?
Exactly.
Or you could notice obvious patterns, right? But like, the problem with noticing obvious patterns is then, like, there are very unpleasant conversations and conclusions that you have to have. And so it's a lot easier to say, well, it's just incompetence. What I will say is this. What I will say is that people respond to incentives. And this is why I am very interested in the mechanical understanding of politics, even though, again, it's only one lens. It doesn't solve everything, and focusing on it all the time is to your detriment. I think it is really valuable right now because so many people are so deeply awash in ideology that they can't see the basic things that are happening right in front of them. You know, like if the Republicans opposed immigration, they would take action, right? If the Tories opposed immigration, they would take action.
Yes.
But they don't take action. And you can keep saying, well, these people are just bumbling idiots and that's why they don't take action. Or you can look at the far more obvious and unpleasant explanation, which is that no one in my elite class opposes this. I have no representation at these levels. But that's a much more difficult thing to say, right? So it's much easier to lie to yourself about this. Now, I will say most people in these positions, I think, are not completely, again, Machiavellian. I think if you talked to most guys in the GOP, they would have some explanation as to why they can't do it, right? Like they would believe it. It wouldn't just be completely convenient for them. Sure. It is very convenient. Like they are more likely to believe it because it is very convenient for them, but they would have some justification. Well, we just can't get to this. There's this thing blocking this. And, you know, at some point we'll secure this many seats or this leadership position, or we'll take back a Supreme Court seat, and then all this stuff will change. And then all of it happens and none of it does, but whatever, you know, like what else are you going to do? This is the system. And so I think I think most people are not just cynical actors. I think that they do believe, at least on some level, in kind of like what they're doing, because if for no other reason, like they need to sleep at night, right?
Yes.
Like most people are just not maniacal mustache.
Everyone has to think they're a good guy on some level, right? Even if they think they're doing bad to achieve good ends, right?
That's exactly right.
Yes.
And so I don't think that so when we say it's malice, I want to be clear that I don't think that it's a bunch of people who are intentionally like, I'm going to destroy this country and like drive down wages and make it impossible to form a family because like I just hate these people. I think they have ideological and practical justifications at every level that say this is the way that things have to work. But that doesn't change the reality on the ground, which is the things they are doing are malicious and they do hurt people, right? And they do, and that's why I am so often trying to get people on my side to look beyond the ideological rhetoric and peer into the mechanism and say, okay, this is what these people say, but what do they do? What actually happens? What keeps occurring over and over again? And what do the outcomes say about what these people are, the rhetoric that they're advancing? Like, how are these things different? Why are they different? And like, what can we do about that? Right. And I think that's a much clearer way in the current year to kind of understand our political situation rather than trying to make people's political ideologies line up and make sense with what they're doing, because they won't.
Right. I think there's a last thing to say, and then we'll wrap after this. One thing I want to actually talk about a bit meta-contextually is actually this type of interview I'm doing now. One of the reasons I wanted to do an interview series like this, where I just pick totally diverse, different people from any area that I'm interested in or someone's work I'm interested in, is because I actually find a lot of what makes conversations boring, in my opinion, on the internet is that they're so surface level or they're so topical to something that's going to be so fleeting and it's going to age so poorly as an interesting topic. Like, spoiler, anyone anyone out there, try going and listening to a political podcast from even a year ago. It will be intolerable. You won't be able to get through an hour because if they're talking about like everyday things of like the current thing, it'll be a nightmare. You'll just feel like you're watching some show that you've already seen 7 seasons of, and you went back to season 2 and you sort of know what's going to happen. You won't be able to handle it. It'll seem so trash. And one of the problems I've noticed is this. I actually think part of why they've kept political discourse so reductive, limited, and I would actually say so sticky, I'll explain what I mean by that, is if I look at what the function, these current things being thrown up over and over again, you can use psyops if you want that term, whatever you think these are for, the end result, as far as I can tell, is they're kind of like social honeypots. They're just someone offering you want to wreck yourself this way? You want to align yourself with this guy, who, by the way, next week we're going to do some really crazy shit. You want to join with this guy now, where at the moment he seems like you agree with his position, but in a year it's going to be really bad and you'll wish you never put your name on the record. It feels like that's the main thing all those things actually accomplish. Whereas I genuinely believe, mate, there are ways to discuss almost any topic, including dreaded illnesses, political philosophies, historical figures that are considered bad. It's just that to do it, you have to essentially so I'm actually interested in the occult world. So I'm also interested in the idea that symbols and words as symbols have incredible power that become imbued in them. And as a result, I often describe certain words that would get you into trouble as cursed words. The idea is you have to think of it as your enemy already charged that with a certain energy, that it doesn't matter what energy you engage with it now, what your intention is, other people are going to read it that way with the energy that was already sort of surrounding that and will associate that with you. And so what I think is, in the modern day, I think you can have any conversation. I think you do not have to get banned off the internet and censor. It's just you have to do it kind of like we have here. You have to very carefully, sometimes sort of like scale up or talk a little bit more abstractly or get around a curse term so you convey the meaning but you don't hit the word that then makes the associations come. The obvious issue is, though, you can do it, but first of all it's trickier, and secondly the obvious follow-on is it will never seemingly be mainstream. Like, it's not sexy. Like, one of the things that drives me mad is, let's say certain famous people who are banned off the internet, Auron, who are known for exposing things or having outrageous political opinions, right? When these sorts of people say all that stuff, you know, the stupid normie retort is like, no, why do they have to always mix in, like, you know, sensationalism and over-egg the pudding? It's like, because you wouldn't listen if they didn't do that. You don't know the guy who, like, there's a million people like you and way more than you, that people who are just doing, like, fairly, like, staid academic work and talking about things from books that aren't at all controversial. It's just those don't sell. People aren't going to click that. So in a way, I feel like there's some hope in the sense that you can have all these great conversations, I think, and still make intellectual progress. It's just that the downside is I don't think it'll ever be a thing for normies. So I've sort of, if you've noticed, tried at the end to almost come back to where we were at the beginning. Like, it is almost like intellectually at least, politics and political theory is still sort of an aristocratic ideal, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's the whole thing with Twitter last week, and a lot of journalists couldn't post what they wanted, and they were like, oh my gosh, I have to use code words to get around bans on Twitter. Yeah. And it's like, oh, so you spent one day as someone who's not a rabid
first time
on Twitter. Exactly. Yeah, the first time being. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, no, that's 100% right. Like, that's honestly like one of the things from kind of the corner of the internet I came from is, like, one of the reasons that it was kind of allowed to continue to exist is it was having important conversations that otherwise you wouldn't be able to have, but it had to do with a certain level of kind of esoteric, between itself and a popular audience, which means, like you said, you're just never going to go wide with a lot of that stuff because it can't appeal to the masses. But at the same time, that's kind of okay because it has a certain level of gatekeeping built into it, right? Like, the people who are going to be able to be kind of involved are going to have a certain level of skill and be mentally nimble and well-versed in a way, because if they weren't, then they wouldn't be able to continue to exist on the internet anyway. So I think that, that does create a natural barrier. It's a weird one that this isn't what would have created the barrier to kind of political interest or philosophy or otherwise made this an aristocratic pursuit in any other age. But it does create that barrier, and it does create that community. And so I think you're right that will keep, at least everyone will think they have a political opinion. That's the story of our time, right? Everyone
Yes.
is sure that they know how politics works. But to have a certain type of political conversation, you do have to have that skill, and that means it will always limit its reach. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're not bought on the political formula of or not sold on the political formula of democracy, if you're not sold on the idea that like the masses are the key always to victory and legitimacy, then maybe the appealing to the masses isn't the key thing, and that's okay.
This video was kindly supported by Realm, ppnomula, and a special thanks goes out to Raw Daughter. Would you like to choose the next topic I focus on? Do you want to ask me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want teasers to find out who the next guests are for Thorinquiry episodes? Maybe you want to take part in a private, never-to-be-published discussion with me. Well, if so, heed this call to action and join Thorin's side today in the Patreon link in the description box below.